The guy coming on right now is an economist, a professor, an attorney, a businessman, an activist. He's taught a variety of courses on economics and businesses. He currently teaches at New York University. I could go on and on and on, and I would, but if we had time. But I'm just going to back up and say I saw Howard Yaruss on a podcast with Kim Carson, and he was talking about his childhood, and he says, he's the guy whose parents wouldn't open a bank. Howard, good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here.
You remember saying that?
I sure do.
And but you have really didn't open a bank, but you know all about it, and you've written a book that's going to be republished coming up, well, almost next month in August, on August 5th to be exact. The book is Understandable Economics, because understanding our economy is easier than you think and more important than you know. And, you know, from that title, boy, I don't want to throw shade on Washington, but it's easier than you think. It has to be, because the people in Washington couldn't handle anything more difficult than what we have right now.
Well, actually, they're not handling it.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Most people. So it may not be. That's not an indication that it's easier than you think, but it really is. But even as easy as it is, I think there are a lot of people who are intimidated by it, alienated by it, confused by it. So I wrote the book. So many books on economics have all this jargon, all these formulas, all these graphs. It impedes understanding. And so I tried to write a book that reads like entertaining narrative nonfiction that attempts to explain it all. And so that was the motivation for the book.
I'll tell you this. There's nothing worse than, and we read a lot of books around here. We have a thing called the Sleeper Cab Library. We talk to a lot of different authors. And when it comes to books like the kind that you're writing, this is exactly what we gravitate towards, because the one thing I hate about reading a book, and I've been to a lot of school in my life, is when I feel like about 2 chapters in, am I going to be tested on this later? That creeping feeling begins to kind of creep into the back of my spine. This book does something different. I mean, it really kind of gets down to using metaphors, the idea of like explaining it in a way that people at the kitchen table can really understand it. Not to know the in-depth numbers and all the data points, but to really have an overall sense of the kind of macro view of the economy and how it functions. That's fair, right?
Oh, absolutely fair. It's mathematics is important to tease out the precision about how things relate to each other. But the big concepts, the general relationships between, well, you're printing too much money, there's going to be inflation, should become apparent if you just think about it. Again, the precision, you would need some math. But if you want to get a big picture of how the economy works, you don't need math. And it's so important, this is the other part of the subtitle, to understand it, because how could you trust the quote-unquote experts or the politicians to have the same values you do? Again, economics is about how we allocate all our society produces. And that's, it's important to imbue that with values, with our judgments as to what's fair and what's right. You don't get that by plugging numbers into a formula. Citizens have to be engaged in these decisions to have outcomes that they like.
It seems to me, though, and I don't want to stretch this out into this, quasi-philosophical thing, Howard. Howard Yaruss is with us, and we're talking about his book right now that's going to be, the updated version comes out on August 5. Understandable, not understanding, but understandable economics, because understanding our economy is easier than you think and more important than you know. Look, when I was a kid, I'm 76 years old, so I'm a little boy in the 50s. And I remember, and this is post-World War II now, of course, Korea and everything. So all of those guys are coming back. But the whole thing was about, the future of your family, posterity, what you're building for your family in the future. I don't see that now. I think people just want to know what's coming up this week. They don't care about the environment. They don't. All of that stuff for the future generations is just like, hey, they're on their own. Good luck to them. How cynical is that, But am I a cynic now? I just don't know. I just don't see where people care anymore on a national level.
Cynical. I think you're just looking at what's going on. It seems very unfortunate as someone said, the pendulum in America never seems to land in the middle. It always seems to go from one extreme to the other.
Yes.
And that's the problem we're facing now. And there seems to be an overreaction. I know this is not economics, but the government ignored the border for a while, and now the pendulum has swung entirely the other way. There has to be some middle way. And in the book, I try to be nonpartisan. I try to give people information to help them understand the economy. And people may reach different conclusions than I do about tax cuts for primarily wealthy people, but I just want them to understand what that means and then to apply their own values and judgment as to what would make a good policy. And so, no, there is this obsession with the short term, and maybe I'll speculate one thing. We're so far removed from World War II where we all faced this existential threat. We're all metaphorically fat and happy now, so we can afford to be petty and we can afford to engage in these little skirmishes, and we forget the big picture. Mm-hmm. So that may be something that's going on.
I was watching a show the other night about this woman who has all these tattoos on her body, and it's a giant map to kind of figuring out, this big giant mystery at the heart of the corruption of the FBI.
Yeah.
And I was watching, I have a friend of mine who actually was a regular recurring guest on a show called Fringe, about fringe science experiments that were happening at the highest level, and it all kind of started by tracing the war in Baghdad and all this kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, and we're going to get back to your actual book and understandable economics here in a second, but I'm wondering also if that fat and happiness has actually led to what I call the boredom of prosperity, and people are looking for an adventure and looking for conflict and looking for strife, and in many ways that's kind of muddied the water about our ability to simply understand the basic, simple truths that are in front of us. People like all the idea that if things are good, maybe there's something behind the scenes that isn't, and boy, wouldn't that be fun.
Or be better.
Yeah.
I always use this example. I'll never forget this. When Brexit was being considered in England, I was watching something on television, and it was this overweight family sitting on a couch watching this flat-screen TV, and they said they were for Brexit because they... Oh, by the way, I left out the fact that they were on welfare, what they call in England the dole. So they were being interviewed, and they said, well, we can't imagine things getting any worse. And I think this gets back to the World War II thing. They had no concept that 60,000 people died on the streets of London from Nazi bombing.
Yeah.
I think they're just forgetting this is the baseline, that they can't get any worse. They have not seen during their lives anything worse than what they see today. So they feel, well, let's take a chance. Even if they don't think it could be better, they don't realize the risks. They don't understand that it could get so much worse. And I think that's the problem.
I want to pivot here because one of the other things I love about the book is that, the idea that a person can watch television. And look, there are certain things that are debatable. There really is a debate about where money, discretionary spending should be allocated. There is a very serious discussion about the size of the federal government, the scope of its powers. All of those things are very worthy of debate. What isn't worthy of debate is the mechanisms of what something does. And I want to kind of start with tariffs here really quickly, because the idea that people should be able to watch a television and go, that's not what a tariff does. That whether or not I like the tariff or not, or understand it, but that if I don't understand it, how can I have a position on whether or not we should have it? You just kind of want people to understand this is what this is, right? That's the basic foundation.
Absolutely.
Can you talk...
And then to make their own decisions.
Yeah. Can you kind of talk about what a tariff is? I mean,
it's very simple,
yeah.
And there's a lot of misunderstanding. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. It's like a sales tax on imported goods. So I think most people who hear that could understand how it's going to increase what they have to pay for imported goods. But the point that I make in the book is that it not only increases what you pay for imported goods, it increases what you pay for domestic goods. Because quite simply, if you like French wine that costs $20 a bottle and suddenly it becomes $26 because of the tariff, the California winemaker who sells the wine for $20 is going to say, hey, my competitor's price just went from 20 to 26. Maybe I could raise my price now to 24 and not lose any business. So it not only increases the prices of imported goods, and we import a lot of goods, but it allows the domestic producers to increase their price as well without losing any customers, which is what any rational business person would do. If you could raise your price without losing customers, they'd go for it. So it raises all prices. And that's the point I think people should try to get their heads around with regard to tariffs.
So basically, it's a couple of guys sitting in a room and they say, Dave, yeah, we could actually increase our price here and maybe even increase our market share. You would actually be fired for malfeasance if you didn't do that. Your board of directors would want to have a long conversation with you about you better have some kind of forward-thinking Henry Ford model of kind of a sane moment, because if you don't do this, you're fired. I mean, that's the thing. The fiduciary responsibility that you would have to your stockholders, you'd be run up the street for not doing it, right?
It's essentially a no-brainer. And you don't have to increase it to $26 in my example. You can increase it to $24 and still be looked at as
yeah, you don't want to get greedy.
Yeah.
So that's what tariffs do. And also they're being rolled out in such a haphazard way. Someone pointed out that Trump changed the tariffs 50 times. And there is some justification for tariffs to protect certain industries. But the way it's being rolled out, no sane business person is going to invest billions of dollars in a new factory that takes 10 years to build based upon the tariff regime that's coming and going every few hours in Washington. They need some certainty to make that kind of investment.
One of the big words now is disruption, and where does disruption become destruction? Are they, commingled? All right, so the tariffs are one thing, and if you know what it is, you know what it is, and you deal with it. But as you say, let's say up to 50 times the tariff, so nobody knows what's going on anymore. So is this disruption for the sake of disruption because you think you're going to shake something out that nobody's expecting and it's all going to be wonderful? You know what I'm getting at here?
I know exactly what you're getting at. I'm going to be the rare guest that says, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that.
I can't figure it out. I think there are a lot of guests who will come up with an answer, but they don't know either, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone really knows. I think even if you ask President Trump, I don't think he'd have a good answer to that himself.
I wanted to ask you another basic question a lot of people don't understand, because worries and concerns about the deficit, they come, they go. It depends upon, who needs to get money for a program or a tax cut. That's always how the deficit is kind of run around here. Can you kind of explain the difference between running deficits when interest rates are low and the difference between that when the interest rates are high, and the idea of crowding out investment in the market? Can you kind of give our listeners a really basic understanding of when deficits are good and when deficits are bad?
Oh, that's very easy, and it's often made much more complicated by the people who know about it. Here goes. A deficit, the federal government is just like you and me. They have a certain income, their income is taxes, and a certain amount of spending. And if the spending exceeds the taxes, they have to borrow, just like you. If you're spending $100,000 a year and earning $90,000, you have to borrow $10,000. So what the debt is the accumulation of all that debt. What the federal debt is the accumulation of all that debt over the years. There's about $29 trillion. I always, when I put that on the board in class, I always use all the zeros, dollars of debt out there. That's a lot of money. The proposed bill in front of the Senate literally today would add another $4 trillion to that. And that's, you can question it. And this is where the analogy to yourself works really well. If you borrow money to go to medical school or start a good business, that makes good sense. If you're borrowing money just to, put the grocery bill down the road, no, that doesn't make sense. So it depends what we're borrowing for. And that's where your values and your judgment come in. Debt by itself is not necessarily bad. That's something that also needs to be thought about. But it's a question of what it's being used for. I have my own opinions as to whether the debt right now makes sense. And I guess you could tell by the tone of my voice, no. But in any event, sometimes debt is good. If you're building bridges and infrastructure and educating kids, and yes, I think you could argue that it makes sense. But if you're just pushing expenses down the road, no.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, too, that you can actually people don't realize this, that sometimes by paying down the debt, you can encourage more people to invest in the United States by buying bonds. I mean, you really kind of reassure the bond market. There's all... we could actually talk for a long time about this, Howard. We're run out of time here. We're going to have you back. Promise us you're going to come back, please.
Oh, promise me you'll have me back. I'd love to come back.
All right.
We promise.
Howard Yaruss joins us this morning. It's YARUSS.com, HowardYaruss.com. The name of the book, and it actually gets republished on August the 5th, is Understandable Economics, because understanding our economy is easier than you think and more important than you think. It'll be out from Prometheus Books. It actually is one of those rare economic books that needs an audio book. Do you have any plans to do that?
There is an audiobook, yes. It's an audiobook of the first version. So, yes, the audiobook is out there. The paperback is coming out, as you said, in August. So I hope people take a look, and I look forward to hearing back from you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Howard, for making the time for us today. And by the way, you know what most of our listeners do for a living, Howard, so a lot of them are probably going to get their hands on that Audible and give it a good listen. You guys should do that.